Into Exile. Hello, I'm Dr. Andrew Marquez, and this is the Baptist on the Bible podcast. Here is your 7 at 7 devotion, a 7-minute encouragement from Scripture, offered every Monday and Friday at 7 a.m. And today we are looking at the book of Daniel, and we're beginning in chapter 1 with the title, Into Exile. What does it look like when the people of God are thrust into exile? What is the attitude that we should take as we find ourselves on the outs with society and maybe even defeated from our former status? Is it something that we should be fearful of? Is it something that we should be looking for? There's a lot of attitudes and ideas about this, and I just thought it would be helpful to look at this from the perspective of Daniel and the four children that were taken as slaves into exile in Babylon. And so the focus of today, as we start digging into this study, will be surrender to God's sovereignty. Surrender to the sovereignty of God. When we find ourselves in difficult times, in hard circumstances, even in the posture of the exiles, we need to remember that God is in control. So that's what we're going to focus on as we look through the first seven verses of Daniel chapter 1. Let's go ahead and read those together, and then we'll dig in a little deeper. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, and some of the articles of the house of God, which he carried into the land of Shinar, to the house of his gods. And he brought the articles into the treasure house of his God. And the king instructed Ashpenaz, the master of his eunuchs, to bring some of the children of Israel, and some of the king's descendants, and some of the nobles, young men in whom there was no blemish, but good-looking, gifted in all wisdom, possessing knowledge and quick to understand, who had ability to serve in the king's palace, and whom they might teach the language and literature of the Chaldeans. And the king appointed for them a daily provision of the king's delicacies, and of the wine which he drank, and 3 years of training for them, so that at the end of that time they might serve before the king. Now from among those of the sons of Judah were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. To them the chief of the eunuchs gave the names. He gave Daniel the name Belteshazzar, to Hananiah Shadrach, to Mishael Meshach, and to Azariah Abednego. Again, we're very familiar with these 4 men. If you've grown up in church or kind of just started working your way through the Old Testament, there are few more famous than Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, and of course Daniel. Now, it's interesting as we look at this that those were not their names. We usually remember Daniel, but we remember the other Israelites by their names of Babylon, and that's interesting. I'm not sure that that's what we should do. But recognize that in the midst of everything, God is in control, and even as Babylon appears to be running the show, God has already infiltrated the empire with his own people. And so let's look at this. Surrender to the sovereignty of God. In the midst of the collapse of the Jewish Israelite nation, all right, the northern tribes were destroyed under Assyria, and now the southern tribes, Judah, has been wiped off the map and is now subservient to Babylon. In the deepest, darkest times, God is in control. Notice what we see in verses 1 and 2. God is the one that gives Jehoiakim over to Nebuchadnezzar. God is the one that allows his people to fall, and it's because of punishment. Their sins have resulted in his punishment. And so, regardless of what's going on, if it looks like things are going downhill and you say, where is God in the mix? Remember that God is in control. He permits destruction. And despite the sorrow that comes along with it, he permits that destruction often to advance his purposes. And depending on where we find ourselves in human history, it might be a difficult time for us, but it's in the midst of those difficult times that God also brings forth his people, and heroic people for heroic deeds. So he is allowing destruction, yet at the same time arranging relief. Notice Proverbs 21:1, it says, "The king's heart is in the hand of the Lord. Like the rivers of water, he turns it wherever he wishes." King Nebuchadnezzar believes that he is in charge. And despite that belief, God has already brought great, wonderful servants of himself into the king's court. And these young men are being trained and groomed to be great counselors to the new empire. And so as Judah falls, it becomes perhaps even more powerful than before because believers in Yahweh found themselves with the ear of the king. And so that is what is being groomed. Years before anyone will recognize that's what's going on, that is what God has placed into place. And so if you're worried about where things are going in the world, recognize that God probably already has placed his people in key positions in order to work out his will in the future. And so we don't have to be afraid. We recognize God is the one who arranges relief and allows disaster. Finally, he will reveal himself through the midst of it all. When you would expect people to say, "Where is God? He is so silent," he reveals himself primarily through his people. And look at the revelation we have here, the names: Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah. The names mean Daniel, God is my judge. Hananiah, Yahweh is gracious. Mishael, who is what God is. And Azariah, Yahweh helps. And so we have God revealed in these young men who have been named to honor God, placed in positions of power. And Nebuchadnezzar changes their names, but he cannot change their identity. Daniel is changed to Belteshazzar. Bel, protect his life. Hananiah becomes Shadrach, command of Aku, the God. Who is what God is? Mishael becomes who is what Aku is, Meshach. And Azariah becomes servant of Nego, which of course we recognize as Abednego. And so their names are changed, their identities appear to be placed under the lordship of the Babylonian gods, but we know that God is revealing himself through these young men as they will seek to be faithful to the true God. God is in control. Despite whatever disaster might fall, whatever worries you have on the horizon, find solace in the sovereignty of God. He holds the world and he holds you. And I hope that encourages you today. God bless and take care.